This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On November the 28th, our final Defence and Security Studies evening of the year featured Canadian writer and commentator John Robson on the topic Upper Volta with Rockets. Take it away, Dan and John.
Okay, so good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Royal Canadian Military Institute Defence and Security Studies evening. I'm Dr. Daniel Eustace. I'm the director of the Defence and Security Studies program, and it's my pleasure to have you here tonight with our guest, Dr. John Robson. John, it's great to see you. The last time we had you talking to RCMI members was in Ottawa in the BC period before COVID at the Rideau Club, and it was an extremely well-attended event. And I recall it was a great presentation that you did. So I was really quite keen on getting you back again to talk to our membership. We at the RCMI basically went virtual somewhere. I can't recall now. Memory's getting foggy. I'm going to say somewhere around March of 2020. And from that point on, we essentially had speaker events and in fact, two conferences. The 2020 conference was canceled entirely because we were too close to the April date. But the 2021 and the 2022 conferences all went virtual and were great. We don't want to get too comfortable in that mode, but having said that, there's certainly I think a degree of reluctance for folks to show up down at the RCMI in person. The government continues to extol the virtues of wearing masks and whatnot. So we haven't been able to have everyone down there in person that we would like to, and that includes John. But we were very, very happy that he agreed and was very flexible to come back to us in a virtual presentation, which we have tonight. So we're very thankful to him, and we're very thankful that you have also decided to join us. So that's great. To be honest, much of the material, much of the content that the RCMI has been putting out from my program over the past several months has obviously been focused on the Ukraine. It's kind of hard to avoid. It's like, hey, there's a war, and we need to talk about that. I'm currently involved with revamping a course for what we call the developmental period 4 period, which is for full colonels and above. And last night, as I was lying in bed, as I often do, thinking about things I have to do, I had sort of 3 data points in my mind. One was the fact that I have to get this course curriculum sorted out to quote unquote contemporize this course on current and complex operations. And then the second data point had to do with the fact that yesterday, I think it was yesterday or the day before, the chief of the defense staff said, well, we really have come to the conclusion that Canada really could not operate in such an environment. We would not succeed. We'd have a very difficult time even doing what we did in Afghanistan because we simply don't have the personnel or the equipment. And then the third data point was what the heck was going on in Ukraine with daily multiple barrages of missiles and rockets and drones. And, here I'm going, how do I revamp this course to talk to full colonels and brigadier generals about what they ought to be thinking about in the context of those 2 data points? Well, I'm not asking John to help me sort that out tonight, but I think that I suspect he's going to bring us a very interesting perspective because he always has a very interesting perspective, well-respected individual in the media and elsewhere. And I'll just, for those of you who have lost track of your emails, given the multiple numbers that you receive daily, I will just, if John will permit me for a moment, just refer to the small bio, which could be multiple pages longer. But tonight's John's presentation is entitled Upper Volta with Rockets, Putin's War on Ukraine. Now, John is a writer, he's a filmmaker, he's the executive director of the Climate Discussion Nexus, he's a documentary filmmaker, he has written for the National Post, Epoch Times, and I love this title, Loony Politics, which I think is probably more like mainstream politics today, but anyways, it's called Loony Politics. He's a columnist and contributing editor of the Dorchester Review, which if you haven't ever tuned into that, it's a great John has a solid academic background with a BA and MA in history from U of T and a PhD in American history from the University of Texas at Austin. For those of you who have followed his career, you will know that he's worked in academia, think tanks, politics, and in every aspect of journalism in Canada. He's produced and hosted documentaries. One that's very well known, The Great War Remembered. That was for the Sun News Network in 2014. And he crowdfunded the documentary and companion book, Magna Carta, Our Shared Legacy of Liberty in 2015 and A Right to Arms in 2016. And the documentaries True, Strong, North and Free, Fixing Canada's Constitution in 2016 and the Environment, A True Story in 2017 were all very well received. So John's a well-educated, well-rounded, well-known, and very, very popular media personality, but with a solid background. And we're so happy to have you speaking to us tonight. I asked John before we started whether he was comfortable in having this production videotaped. He said that he was. And for those of you who are well known to our series, you'll find it hopefully within about 24 hours, courtesy of Eric Morris online on our YouTube station. And I would highly recommend that you direct other folks to this particular presentation. So John, with that, welcome. I thank you for taking the time to do this and for your flexibility to go online. And I'd now like to turn it over to you. By the way, folks, the chat call or the chat section has been turned off. Please enter your questions and answers into the Q&A function. And when we get to the point where John has completed his presentation, I will moderate that, and I will be looking at the Q&A function. And at the same time, you can also raise your hands and ask questions of John, and I will moderate that as well. Okay, so if we have any confusion, we'll try to sort it out, but hopefully we won't. So John, over to you, and thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here to give you my reassuring, scary talk on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It is odd to think that the last time we met, any of you who habitually carried a mask were either skiers or bank robbers. And I very much enjoy talking to military audiences, because I don't think there is any subject on which mistakes that you make will be spotted and pointed out more with greater certainty. And I remember years ago writing for the Ottawa Citizen an editorial about the finding of the USS Yorkton, in which I claimed it had been sunk by a Japanese destroyer. So I don't think I can say anything more ignorant than that in this talk, but that's not to say that I'm not going to get pounced on. However, we shall proceed nevertheless, and I call it my reassuring scary talk, and I presume it's scary for several pretty obvious reasons, starting with nuclear weapons. You remember this slogan from the peace movement way back when, and I enjoy public debate to the point that if someone comes up with something that I think is wrong but is clever, I can enjoy it, and that was certainly very clever. The talk is also reassuring for several obvious reasons, the first of which being that we are gathered here to talk about what looks like Ukraine's very successful resistance, instead of conducting a post-mortem on its rapid and predictable defeat. But with that said, the question that confronted me is, what can I say that is not obvious, especially to this group, without falling into the category of Yorkton was sunk by a destroyer? And I decided that what I was going to do was to talk about the things that have surprised me about the war, of which there are a fair number. And then in the question and answer period, we can see whether this was a thought-provoking list of historical peculiarities, or whether I'm basically adult and shouldn't have been invited. And for starters, the original topic when Dan and I were discussing this presentation was going to be when blue and yellow met green. Because a big part of the story, especially early on, was the fact that Western Europe's strategic response to Russia's invasion was very difficult because the Europeans had deliberately made themselves hostage to Russian natural gas. And this was an extraordinary thing, it seems to me, for them to have done. And even if you buy the climate scare, and I, as I think many of you know, would not do so even if permitted to pay in rubles, the idea that burning your own natural gas was not a good idea, but burning Putin's natural gas was fine, and that burning neither and instead running your own nuclear reactors was some sort of disastrous blunder, was so clearly self-defeating that it almost smacked of the famous liberal death wish, not to put too fine a point on it. And I don't know if we've learned a lesson there, but it actually looks to me as though we have, including a lot of people in Europe who are not merely turning the coal plants back on in a panic, but are maybe rethinking the whole strategic and even economic approach. And there's a line that I frequently find myself quoting in situations like this, and it comes from a science fiction writer. That's a term that encompasses a wide variety of viewpoints and also levels of skill and levels of sophistication, from the completely juvenile to the deeply philosophical. C.S. Lewis, for instance, wrote a science fiction trilogy. But Philip K. Dick used his science fiction writing often to explore difficult epistemological issues of the how does a flawed human brain analyze the operations of a flawed human brain variety. And he came up with this sort of Samuel Johnson-like observation, ultimately, that reality is that which, when you stop believing in it, it doesn't go away. And there has been a kind of Philip K. Dick moment with regard to the necessity to have secure supplies of energy and not get rid of the one that works until the one you think is going to work is in place and is actually working. So that is one thing that I think has emerged from the war that I hadn't anticipated, though, of course, if you told me Russia was going to invade Ukraine, then I think I could have worked that one out subsequently. This is really part and parcel of the surprise of Putin engaging in this reckless act of overreach. But of course, one of the things that consistently surprises me about public policy is the way in which people are surprised by things that they shouldn't be surprised by. And one of these is the overall feeble performance of wind and solar power. Anybody who has a basic grounding in physics and engineering should have been able to see that you could not deploy these things on a sufficient scale to have a reliable source of energy that made hydrocarbons and nuclear power unnecessary, except in a few jurisdictions blessed with so much hydropower that they can maintain the base load and deal with the fluctuations. I mean, wind power often doesn't work because the wind doesn't blow when you most need it. And solar power is not so great when the sun goes down, which is often when people start turning things on or turning them up. And there's also this extraordinarily successful public relations campaign against fracking, that somehow fracking was taken to be not just the production of natural gas, which some people don't like natural gas, but some specially destructive and evil approach to energy policy. And the same thing, again, is true of nuclear power. The Germans switching off their nuclear reactors because they didn't like greenhouse gases was something that really beggared belief. And eventually even Greta Thunberg said, well, I don't really think we should turn off nuclear reactors that are already running and then start burning coal. You shouldn't need her to come up with this insight. But if you do, there's something a bit peculiar about your mental processes. And again, there is this uneasy feeling, and this has always been a bit of an issue with Germany, even when it wasn't on one of its rampages, that somehow German thinkers and politicians and the German elite regards the West with something less than wholehearted enthusiasm. Theodor von Laue, in his book, The World Revolution of Westernization, says Germany is one of the first examples of a country that was on the periphery of the West, awed by its capacities and desirous of adopting many of its techniques, but in order to fend off Western culture rather than, or I mean, civilization. The Germans had culture and we had civilization. And in a way, the German elite's willingness to cozy up to Vladimir Putin and their contempt for the United States. Remember that famous scene where Donald Trump tells them at the UN, you don't want to become dependent on Russian national gas, and the Germans are literally laughing in his face. So that was kind of odd. But then, a lot of surprises here. I was pleasantly surprised by the way in which, when push came to shove, the Western democracies pulled together more decisively than I would have expected them to do. And when you look at this in historical context, I think it is clear that the self-governing societies are a lot stronger than they look, and tyrannies are far more brittle, because tyrannies are able to focus what they've got single-mindedly on a particular goal and to pursue it relentlessly and subordinate everything else to it. Whereas democracies fuss around. People have different preoccupations and different concerns. Pardon me, I should put up this title. There we go. You see this when a crisis comes along, that suddenly, when you look at, for instance, a classic example, the Japanese spent 10 years planning the attack on Pearl Harbor, but it's only 7 months until the Americans deal them the decisive blow at Midway with an inferior force that undoes all that scheming. And so when push does come to shove, the people who reliably get surprised are the tyrants. And again, that shouldn't be all that surprising, because they intentionally suppress the free flow of information, especially unwelcome information. And as a result, they rather reliably don't have important, unwelcome facts. Still, it was nice to see this, though I wish the occasion hadn't arisen for the demonstration. And in this context, there's a famous story among Canadian journalists of Franklin Roosevelt reacting to the attack on Pearl Harbor by asking aides, what kind of people do they think we are? And Canadian journalists, I should say, have an unfortunate tendency when fact-checking to look up what one another have said. So I found 3 different examples of this being cited. But in point of fact, it was not Franklin Roosevelt who said this. It was Winston Churchill. And he was addressing a joint session of Congress. And speaking of the English-speaking people, the Anglosphere, he said, what kind of a people do they think we are? And then he said, they're about to find out again. And sure enough, they did. And that seems to have happened to Vladimir Putin. And then there's another story about Pearl Harbor that's even more apocryphal, because as far as I can tell, in this case, nobody said it. It's attributed to Admiral Yamamoto that all they had done was wake a sleeping dragon. And though he didn't say it, it reminds me of something J.M. Barrie said about the theory that Bacon had written the works of Shakespeare. And he said he didn't know whether he had, but if he didn't, he missed the opportunity of a lifetime. And so this line from Yamamoto turns up in all sorts of movies, including Tora, 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 but there is really no evidence that he ever actually said it. On the other hand, to give him credit, Yamamoto did oppose the attack on Pearl Harbor. And one reason why is that he had studied at Harvard. He'd traveled extensively in the United States while he was naval attaché in Washington, and he was fluent in English. And he did not think the United States could win a sustained war, that Japan could win a sustained war with the United States, which I think was widely believed in the Japanese command. But Yamamoto also didn't believe the Americans would fold up. That was the calculation he thought was wrong. He had a better sense of what kind of people the Anglosphere in particular were, and I hope still are, than his more insular colleagues. And sure enough, one of the statistics, which I think is very telling, is that Detroit alone produced more war material than the entire Japanese nation. I think the Ford Motor Company alone outproduced Japan in terms of weight of war material, though I stand to be corrected, and this audience certainly will be if I've got that wrong. It is certainly true that the United States devoted only 15% of its military budget to the effort against Japan. The rest of it was directed against Germany. And so the idea that Americans were not a resilient people capable of going from being pretty much disarmed at the time of Pearl Harbor to being a terribly formidable force, Yamamoto's dragon, whether he said it or not, is one of those things that surprised the tyrants in a way that, shouldn't be surprising and yet is. But another thing that surprises me, and this is again a chronic irritation as well as a surprise, is the astonishingly feckless way that Western politicians behave until the national security threat becomes impossible to ignore. In the latter part of the Cold War, I read Jean-Francois Revel's How Democracies Perish, and I'm still filled not just with rage, but with panic, even though I know we won. But it's astonishing as he walks you through the fatuity, and sometimes worse, again, there is this tendency of some European policymakers to act very much as though they didn't want the West to win the Cold War. I don't know that treason is quite the right word for it, but there is something worse than just silliness going on. And yet, of course, despite all that, we did our best to lose, but unfortunately, the Soviets beat us at that game, and we did come out on top. And so now you're looking, even with what's going on in Ukraine, you get people like our own Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, saying that Putin's attack will accelerate the transition to alternative fuels, even as Germany reactivates its coal plants. Now, I guess there's a sense in which it's true. News stories say that Poles are being reduced to burning trash for want of other fuel, although I don't think that's quite the alternative that Mr. Trudeau had in mind. But so you see that even now, you have this kind of frivolous detachment from reality. The idea that we're suddenly going to build enough solar panels that Canada can shut down the oil sands. And again, if you do the basic calculations of the footprint that you'd need, this is something which is not so much wrong as it is absurd. And you can be very, very sure that Justin Trudeau has not done those calculations and that he is not surrounded by people who have. So here we see a continuation in some ways of Western fecklessness, and yet it looks as though Ukraine, with the help of advanced American technology in particular, is dealing Russia a defeat that may finish it, not just as a world power, which I'm going to argue is a status it never really enjoyed despite appearances, but it may even finish it as a nation. What's happening in Ukraine, I think, is very, very serious, not just to the Putin regime, but to the self-understanding of Russia's elite and even of its people. According to their view of the world, this cannot be happening. And sometimes reality, as Philip K. Dick noted, if it doesn't go away, does actually get through to you. And so this big surprise that forced me to change my title is that we're discussing a war in progress rather than the swift and tragic crushing of a brave but overpowered independent nation. Again, between our hidden strength and our enemy's hidden stupidity, things are going very differently than I certainly thought they would in the first weeks. By the way, there's a historical maxim variously attributed that Russia is never as strong as it looks, but it's also never as weak as it looks. But I have to say, at the start of this year, it looked stronger than this. If there were regimes that could have defeated Russia in a non-nuclear but otherwise pretty much no-holds-barred war, I would have thought have needed to be one looking stronger than Ukraine did. And here there's a phrase, I don't know who invented this one. It was Shuvaloy Majumdar of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute that I first heard it from, that Russia had dwindled geopolitically to being a gas station for China. And it's certainly not what Vladimir Putin intended to make of Russia, nor is it what he thought he had made of Russia. So clearly, among the people who have been terribly surprised by how weak Russia turned out to be is Vladimir Putin. He had no idea that his nation and his military were this weak. But again, I don't know how many people predicted that Russia's army was not capable of occupying Ukraine. This is really quite remarkable. And as I say, the implications of this could be very significant, at least for Russia. And frankly, if Russia were to stop trying to destroy the West, it would, as Forrest Gump might say, be one less thing. It would be a very welcome thing. And what I'm getting at is that we may be seeing the last stop for the Third Rome. And here I want to say that something that didn't really surprise me, although maybe I should say it surprised me that it didn't surprise me, is that you had all these experts weighing in on why Putin had launched the invasion and what he hoped to accomplish and how he imagined this conflict. And so many of them seem to think that the last thing you should ever do in order to find out what someone thinks is listen to what they say. Again, we thought we'd learned this lesson after World War II. Everybody said, gosh, I think maybe we should have read Mein Kampf. I gather that he gave some important hints back then. And I take the same view of Stalin's Foundations of Leninism, and have lately been reading Xi Jinping Thought, which is, almost seems like a contradiction in terms. But the fact is the man does engage in mental operations, and it's important to know what they are and see what he's worried about, as well as what he's confident about, even if the former are more realistic than the latter. So in regard to Putin, he gave this speech when Russia annexed 4 pieces of Ukraine. He gave a speech on September 30th, and commentators were indignant that he had said things they did not think were true, which I would have thought you could kind of count on when someone is doing things you think are not a good idea. But it also finally got through to them that Putin didn't really appear to see the world in quite the same way as liberal Westerners. And if I may quote a few of what people thought were his ravings. For instance, he said, the West began its colonial policy back in the Middle Ages and then followed the slave trade, the genocide of Indian tribes in America, the plunder of India, of Africa, the wars of England and France against China. What they did was hooking entire nations on drugs, deliberately exterminating entire ethnic groups. For the sake of land and resources, they hunted people like animals. This is contrary to the very nature of man, truth, freedom, and justice. And thus far, to be honest, you're hearing very little that you wouldn't hear in just about any Western university. This is the sort of thing you could easily find in the editorial pages of a liberal newspaper. This is a vision of the West as having been a colonial, racist, oppressive, exploitative force in the world. What Greta Thunberg recently, doing her Karl Marx and pigtails thing, called extractivism. But he went on to say something very different from what you would hear in such a seminar. He said, now they have moved on entirely to a radical denial of moral norms, religion, and family. The dictatorship of the Western elites is directed against all societies, including the peoples of the Western countries themselves. This is a challenge to all. This is a complete denial of humanity, the overthrow of faith and traditional values. Indeed, the suppression of freedom itself has taken on the features of a religion, outright Satanism. Whoa, what? And I managed to resist the impulse to slow clap as people went, hey, that's not what we think. But what I was really struck by, and I was a bit surprised that people did not know this, is that Putin was reflecting a long-standing position among Russian authorities and Russian thinkers about the West and about Russia's relationship to the West and about Russia's mission to save the West from itself. These are the Slavophile thoughts, going back into the early part of the 19th century, and they certainly incorporate delusions of grandeur. But in order to understand any of this, you need to have some idea what the Slavophile movement was all about, including this belief in Russia's world historic mission to defeat Western decadence, to be the, if I may put it this way, the savior of the universal human race, a title that was, for instance, claimed by Augustus Caesar. And as Anthony Daniels wrote in National Review back in 1995, and it's unkind, but not entirely unfair, quote, without the sheer brute force to overwhelm its neighbors, Russia would be of little account in the world. Its foreign trade is less than Belgium's. Its political traditions are uniformly disastrous, and its material civilization is repellent. yet it also has a belief in its mission civilisatrice. And it's this odd combination of brute power and economic and other weaknesses that created that jibe that furnished me with the title Upper Volta with Rockets. And this, again, it's not an unfair description. George Will, writing in 2020, said, in Putin's ramshackle Russia, successor to the Soviet Union, bracket, Upper Volta with ICBMs, bracket, as recently as 2018, almost a third of medical facilities lacked running water, 40% lacked central heating, and more than half lacked hot water. Now you imagine if you're playing some sort of trivia game and you are given this description of a country. A third of its medical facilities have no running water, 40% have no central heating, more than half lack hot water. What is this country? It would not, I think, occur to most people to suggest that it was a European nation that had, for decades, had credible pretensions to be the future of civilization. I mean, you look at what John Kenneth Galbraith, for instance, is saying about the Soviet economy in 1984, that it works better than ours. And one reason why is it makes full use of manpower. Well, yeah, when you're carrying things on your back, you make full use of manpower. But it was not just decades. In the minds of many in Russia, this idea that it is a beacon to the world, a military, material, and moral giant, goes back half a millennium to the fall of Byzantium, when the czars take over the imperial eagle and claim they are the third Rome. And most people never knew they thought that. They would probably have laughed out loud if they'd known about it, but they didn't laugh because they just didn't know about it. It was like, you've got to be kidding me. If there's a third Rome, it's not out there in the forest, right? It's not out there in the taiga. But if you knew about the Holy Alliance created by Tsar Alexander I after the defeat of Napoleon, you might have had some idea of this kind of grandiosity of Putin's vision, but also its absurdity. And also, I think, of the difficulty people in the West had in taking it seriously, even as an expression of Moscow's delusions. And again, partly because they never heard of it. It's the sort of thing that's just too silly to be the subject even of ridicule. And by the way, in passing, some years back, I decided to track down the Protocols of the Elders of Zion and read it, because I'm very much interested in the persistence and malevolence of anti-Semitism, but also because I'm interested in conspiracy theories generally. They are surprisingly common, and I think that they need to be taken seriously as a force in human affairs. So I was reading the protocols and thinking to myself that I could have done a better forgery in an afternoon, which was a bit of a sorry thought in itself, including about the people who take it seriously. But then I came across a passage which struck me immediately. It was like it was the fingerprint, the inky fingerprint of the author, because the elders at one point commented the two major obstacles to their plan for world conquest are the Catholic Church and the Russian aristocracy. And I thought, well, there is only one group of people on the entire planet who think that the Russian aristocracy is a significant force in world affairs at all, let alone a hugely positive one, and that's the Russian aristocracy. So clearly, the protocols were forged by the Tsar's agents. There is just there's no other explanation for this. And they didn't realize this was a ridiculous thing to say, and that too is classic. So when you get back to the Holy Alliance, to the extent that they noticed it, the European chancelleries thought it's a geopolitical agreement to prevent political liberalism from upsetting the international order. I mean, someone like Metternich took it as a useful thing in that regard. But the Tsar is a different story. And again, it's a classic Russian tale because although the Tsar obviously is sort of the guardian of the Holy Church and all that stuff, he hadn't read the Bible at all until he was well into his 30s. He'd been Tsar for a decade. In fact, he didn't even own a Bible. And when he read it, and this can happen to you if you're in this kind of peculiarly sheltered position, he immediately decided that he was on a mission from God. And then he died. But it's very clear that Alexander knew little even of Russia, let alone about the West. And in some sense, Putin is better informed. But in some ways, he's even more deluded than most tyrants, even though he's less completely insulated from contrary information than, the rulers of North Korea, let us say. And you see now that Russia is apparently trying to kill off the Ukrainians that Putin denied existed. And it's very much in the spirit of a stalker who says if he can't have the girl, nobody will, which, again, some might think was hard to square with this notion that you have a mission to save the West from its immoral ways. But again, it wouldn't be the first time someone with a messianic complex said, if you won't be saved by me, you'll be damned by me instead. All of this indicates that Putin really does think the kind of things that Putin thinks, and many people at least have been surprised to see this. I haven't been surprised that they were surprised, though I do hope at one point we will begin to understand that when tyrants tell you what they think and what they're going to try and do in elaborate formal pronouncements, that we really ought to assume that they're telling us this because it is actually what they think. So often in politics, what you see is what you get, including with the bad guys. And I know we're not done with useful idiots in the West saying things like, some US and Western officials think neither side can win and see winter as a shot at diplomacy in Ukraine-Russia war. This use of diplomacy as a sort of magic force that dissolves hostility is again typical of this living in the world of abstractions rather than concrete realities. Obviously, what Putin thinks that winter is a chance to freeze the Ukrainians to death, and since they've rejected his advances, it will serve them right. And again, I should mention that Putin targeting in Ukraine's energy infrastructure shows that he at least has a pretty clear understanding of how essential to survival as well as flourishing it is to have reliable, affordable energy. I say again, this messianic complex matters, but I think most Western pundits had never heard of the Slavophile movement. And again, one of the rules of history, that I think is absolutely reliable is that ideas have consequences. And I had a minor in Soviet affairs when I was doing my PhD, and so I have long followed and tried to get a comprehensive and broad look at Russia and its place in the world. Very frustrated that Russia has not been willing to be more enthusiastically a member of the West, and hope springs eternal, though it's pretty difficult. But because of this, I remember I found this throwaway line in Josephine Tay's book, Miss Pym Disposes, in which there's this elderly Swedish woman who's visiting England, and she says to her host, "Please do not think that I am Russian about things." And someone says, "Russian?" And she says, "Yes, naive and ignorant, and sure that no one can do anything as well as my own country can do it." So back before multiculturalism made us say that everybody was vibrant, this quality among Russians who should know better was sufficiently pronounced to be noticed and commented on in other countries. And of course, the Soviets were so classic for claiming to have invented everything that Pavel Chekhov on Star Trek was a comic foil, partly because he would always say that everything was a Russian invention. And you might think, oh yeah, but that's just because as Bolsheviks, they think that communism is the wave of the future. So of course, it's coming up with all the dynamic inventions. But it wasn't that, or at least not entirely that. It was a deep-seated Russian habit. And so, again, this part of it surprised me less than it surprised a lot of people that it shouldn't have surprised. But even so, even understanding all this, I was surprised that the delusion led Russia to come such a enormous cropper on the battlefield. And again, I feel maybe I should have seen this coming. Somebody once told me that you couldn't understand Russian history unless you knew that they'd made the biggest bell and the biggest cannon in the history of the world, and that neither had worked. And this was back before the fall of the Soviet Union. And I thought it was a neat metaphor indicating the continuity of history, with Soviet ideology becoming the biggest bell and the Red Army being the biggest cannon. And I mentioned you've got that line that Russia's never as strong as it looks, and it's never as weak as it looks, which I've seen attributed both to Bismarck and to Metternich, all in the pages of National Review. And I've been writing down not just facts that I've come across that I think are important, but also the source of these facts since about 1984, because of the maxim of Abraham Lincoln that you shouldn't believe every attribution that you find online. But when you think about that line, you think about, well, Russia was not as strong as it looked in 1914. I'm not sure how strong it looked, but it certainly wasn't. It wasn't a great power, even though it looked like one in superficial ways. But it certainly wasn't as weak as it looked in 1941, nor was it as weak as it looked in 1812. And this, of course, raises the possibility that it's not as weak as it looks right now. Maybe Russia will rally and in the end will prevail in this conflict. But when I look at the possibilities and I look at the history of Russia and its military performances, and certainly in Crimea, it was weaker than it looked. I found myself thinking, well, yes, but in these previous wars, both the ones that went better than you'd expect and the ones that went even worse, Ukraine was part of the Russian war effort. And so if you look at Napoleon, the Kaiser, and Hitler, 2 out of 3, maybe some of that was because of the resilience of the Ukrainians specifically. Maybe this was coming out of Kiev rather than, or more than, it was coming out of Moscow. So maybe we are seeing that much of Russia's military prowess over a considerable period of time was actually Ukraine's military prowess, harnessed to Moscow. And if that's true, by the way, that's very good news, and history's not overrun with good news. But Ukraine is the most Western part of Russia. You may say, well, that's not saying much, but remember Kievan Rus, which got the whole deal going, was actually another of these Viking states, the same as Norman England and a number of other places in Western Europe. And it was in pretty close contact with the West until the Mongols came. And there's a lot of ruin in a nation, as Adam Smith said. So maybe Ukraine is poised to become a Western nation again and help extend Western values further into Eastern Europe, and maybe even, and I hope so, to Russia itself. This would be a horrific thing for Russians. But it would also be beneficial to us because, again, Russia's caused us a lot of trouble over the 20th century and into the 21st. And, I'd rather have Russia on our side than on China's side. If they're going to be a gas station, I want them to be our gas station. But, there's more to it than that. There's a lot that is good about Russia. And it is a great pity that it has been directed in this terrible direction. Writing in the Times back in 2000, an English economist born in Moscow named Anatol Kalatsky suggested there was this weird kind of deep-seated and destructive insecurity in Russia. He said, deep down, Russia's leaders have agreed with the Western cynics. If your country is Upper Volta with rockets and you take away the rockets, what do you have left? But he said, Russia is not Upper Volta. It is a richly endowed, highly educated, technologically sophisticated country with a huge potential for rapid economic development. Take away the rockets, and Russia could forget about Upper Volta and get on with becoming an advanced European country. And this had me thinking as well, if Russia hadn't inherited the Soviet nuclear arsenal, would they today build, 5,000 warheads and try to thwart the West? I don't think so, but it's hard to tell because when you say, well, gee, Russia, why don't you become Western? Well, they weren't very keen on the idea under Lenin or Stalin. They weren't very keen on it under Peter the Great, and they weren't keen on it under Ivan the Terrible, and they don't seem to be under Putin the Thug. It's a long-standing thing. But also, there was just a piece in Mercatornet that asked, could Russia collapse? And this reminded me of my, frankly, withering response. Decades ago, there was a news story saying that the economy of Upper Volta might collapse. And I said, how would you tell? But if Slavophilia collapsed, you might get the end, finally, of this world historic delusion that has led Russia to do so much harm to itself and to the rest of the world. And, the defeat in Crimea shook up the Russian elite. It shook up Russian thinkers. There was this sense we cannot go on like this. And there was some attempt to Westernize. They got rid of serfdom and so on. But again, it was just one of these things, we'll adopt their methods and then we'll beat them. Still, if this fails as badly as it looks like it's failing, it may become increasingly hard to believe that Moscow is a tremendous force for good in the world, or even a tremendous force at all, though they do still have the rockets. And of course, after watching the Russian military performance, it would be a bold man who would predict that all those rockets would work, but it would be a madman who predicted they would all fail. So we're not out of Sherwood Forest yet. But it is clear that even if it wouldn't matter in a large-scale nuclear exchange, it's clear that a small difference in technology makes an even bigger difference today than it did in the Yom Kippur War or the Bekaa Valley turkey shoot. And so that's not a surprise, but it's leading me to another surprise. In World War II, you could win with Shermans against Tigers if you had a sufficient numerical advantage. Today, it's not so clear. And I say, though, that didn't surprise me, though I was surprised that Russian weapons weren't better than they apparently were. Because Russia has a long tradition of outstanding mathematical ability and engineering, even if the Soviet central planning kind of made the engineering not do much. Again, you look at their decades-long domination of chess. This is no fluke, and this isn't very Upper Volta-like. Although I do suspect that a lot of talent was diverted into chess because it got you well away from politics. At any event, we have not been seeing, the strategic and tactical prowess of a Botvinnik, a Petrosian, or even Boris Spassky in the war on Ukraine. And now I get to the thing that's really surprised me, and that is how little technology has transformed the battlefield. And you might think, okay, there's one of his big blunders. I mean, smart weapons are hitting things with devastating effectiveness that you didn't have in either world wars, undreamt of, except in the case of precision bombing where it didn't work. And we've all seen these videos of the drone spotting the Russian tank and the missile showing up and blasting it. But in late October, the New York Times wrote, quote, "With Western weapons, Ukraine is turning the tables in an artillery war. In the southern Kherson region, Ukraine now has the advantage in range and precision guidance of artillery, rockets, and drones, erasing what had been a critical Russian asset." And of course, rockets and drones sound 21st century, but artillery war? Amateurs think World War I was all machine guns and World War II was all tanks, but as people in this audience know, in both of those wars, it was artillery that did the majority of the killing, not just the plurality. About 60% of military deaths were the result of artillery. And so once again, we're finding ourselves in a battle in which indirect fire, admittedly now guided and more precise, is once again proving decisive. NBC wrote this rather baffled story on November 10th saying, quote, "Russia and Ukraine are burning through artillery shells and other weapons and ammunition at a rate not seen since the Korean War," officials said, "and will need to restock during the long winter to come. Russia is firing a staggering 20,000 artillery rounds per day," a senior U.S. defense official estimated, while Ukraine is firing from 4,000 to 7,000 rounds daily. Again, a rate not seen since the Korean War, which amazingly is now 70 years in the past, and yet here we are. And in similar vein, The Economist on November 1st emailed me asking, "Has the Ukraine war killed off the ground attack aircraft? The death of the flying tank." And if you're one of these people thinking the future's not all it was cracked up to be, where are the flying tanks? You might find this disappointing. But looking at warfare since 1945, it seems to me that there has been a long effort to update the tactics that took the pillbox of World War I and put it on treads in World War II, and that it has failed again. Because in my view, the flying tank has already died in at least two previous occasions. The first one being Vietnam, where the Americans tried to use helicopters in a similar role to that in which the Germans had employed both tanks and armored personnel carriers, and to some extent even trucks, in its blitzkrieg, mechanized land vehicles. They were going to move ground forces around more quickly than they could march, and they were going to move artillery or bring indirect fire to bear more effectively than horses could have moved it, or even tanks. And I think the same thing happened with the Soviets in Afghanistan. And I should just also mention, I've just been listening to a book on the Battle of Britain, and I think Goering's beloved Der Sturm, Messerschmitt 110, might be considered another failed flying tank. And again, the Economist, I think, got the facts right. It said Russia's close air support jets have been decimated. Old-fashioned air power has kept a low profile in the conflict. Then it goes on about drones and cruise missiles. But it does say that close support aircraft have fared particularly badly. But again, they weren't that great in either World War as well. And so I think that what you're actually seeing, and this is a big surprise, is that we have again got this sort of continuous battlefront of light weapons protecting strong points with artillery and interlocking fields of fire, artillery that had to some extent become mobile by 1918. And so, yeah, people thought you could substitute a Stuka, an A4, or a Hind helicopter for the tank and the howitzer, but you never could. And in this sense, I think we're seeing 20th century warfare again. And speaking of that, Back to the Future, there was a piece in the National Post which had the secondary headline, "Military Experts Say Attack Heralds New Era of Marine Combat." And we had the beloved Canadian angle because it looked as though the Ukrainians were cannibalizing Sea-Doo jet skis for drone attacks on Russia's big lumbering capital ships. And in the Post's November 8th newsletter, they said, "We've all seen dramatic images of the weaponry and destruction on display in Ukraine since the invasion by Russia. But far fewer of what could turn out to be one of the most revolutionary changes to modern warfare, low-cost drones, in which Canada is likely to have played a key role, wreaking havoc on massive and expensive warships." And you go, whoa, there's a real break with the past, unless you know why destroyers are called destroyers, even though they are colloquially tin cans whose fate in naval battles is to be destroyed by one salvo from those big ships. And the reason, of course, is going all the way back to the American Civil War, navies, starting with the Confederates, because they didn't have the big capital ships, have been coming up with light, fast torpedo boats who could weave through the clumsy fields of fire of the bigger ships and then blast them with a torpedo, an explosive at close range. And as battleships got bigger and scarier, especially once you got to the dreadnoughts, they increasingly needed first torpedo gunboats and then torpedo boat destroyers, a designation first officially applied in 1892 to the Daring and Havoc classes in the Royal Navy, to protect the big cruisers and such like from asymmetrical warfare. So in point of fact, what you're seeing with these drones menacing capital ships is the naval planner's nightmare of 1903. We have, in fact, got much the same kind of thing happening now as was happening more than 100 years ago. And to me, this is a huge surprise. Now, as a historian, I like to think the future will be like the past, because if not, we're in a lot of trouble. And I don't just mean professionally, right? As in life, in your private life, the way you try to foresee what's going to happen is to look at what has happened, not because it's that great a guide. We're forever blundering into things, but because it's all we've got. And of course, this is the scientific method too. You go into the laboratory, something happens 3 times, and you say, this reaction that happened in this way in the past will happen again in the future. If it doesn't, all of science collapses. And I do think that a lot of rules of thumb from history still hold. For instance, the one about preparing for war if you want peace. And also one of my Robson's rules of history, never invade Russia. It just is not a good idea. But whether combat in 30 years will still look like combat in the Great War, to the extent that the Ukraine war does, despite the drones and stuff, seems to me to be called into question by the hideous Chinese gun robot dog that you see over there. And I would mention all kinds of people are just goofily gung-ho about artificial intelligence. I do not think that it's going to build a world that will be friendly to humans, but I don't know what to do about it, and that's not my topic. But I am baffled, and I think this pertains to the possible transformation in warfare. I am baffled that the Canadian government, and apparently the American government as well, seriously think that a manned fighter plane purchased today will still be dominating the airspace in 2050. It's like thinking that a Sopwith Camel would be useful in the Battle of Britain, except that technology moves faster now than it did a century ago. But for all of that, it seems to me that one of the big surprises about the whole Russian invasion of Ukraine is how many things haven't changed, from the Slavophile delusion to Russia never being as strong as it looks, to the kind of warfare with continuous battle lines that we're seeing. Remember, you go back to the Napoleonic Wars, you don't have that. Units can operate in isolation. You get the infantry squares, you get the cavalry squadrons, and it's nice if they work together, but they can maneuver independently. But by the time of the Great War, a unit that's isolated is a unit that's dead. And to a surprising degree, that has proved true all the way up to what we're seeing in Ukraine. So I put together a list of things that surprised me by their continuity, even though I'm a historian and shouldn't be surprised. And it starts that Western statesmen are still useful idiots. We really acted like fools in the run up to the aggression, including deliberately making ourselves vulnerable to Putin's energy blackmail. But the second thing is that when push came to shove, the West dug in and pushed back harder. And I do think with our help, Ukraine is going to win. Third, Russia's grandiose self-image led it to a disastrous overreach. The fourth is more general. Tyrants delude themselves. And the fifth one is artillery still wins wars. I really did not think that was going to happen. So looking at the Ukraine war, I am surprised by all sorts of things about how it was fought, not because they're new and different, but because they're actually surprisingly familiar. So these are the things that have surprised me about the war, and we can now do the question period and see what has surprised you about my talk. I am just at the end not going to surprise you by saying, please do visit my website. Among other things, if you haven't already, you can buy the documentaries. I'm always passing the hat for monthly contributions if you value my work. I am to some extent crowdfunded and would appreciate you making a small monthly pledge to help me keep doing it. And also please check out climatediscussionnexus.com if you're not aware of it, because that is where I am conducting putting a great deal of my effort today in attempting to deal with a policy panic that I think is based on bad science. And having said all that, Dan, over to you.
John, thank you. That was wonderful. We do have one question posted so far, and please, folks, add to that. If not, you'll be listening to the questions that I have, of which are many. But let me see what we have here from Harrison Kennedy. So, John, what do you think will happen in the Ukraine war over the winter months? Do you think Russia could launch a large winter offensive as they did in World War II, or could Ukraine launch another counteroffensive, maybe in the Kherson or Zaporozhye oblasts? What's your thoughts about that? This is getting down to the tactical, operational level.
I think a Ukrainian offensive is more probable than a Russian one, because at the time of the Russian offensives in World War II, they had, from an initial disastrous performance, recovered and pulled themselves together and built up their capacity. But I don't think they've done that today. Now, I don't know how their stockpiles of weapons are holding up, but I think that their capacity to mobilize soldiers is not looking very good. I mean, don't forget, in the Great Patriotic War, part of the feeling was, well, the Huns are at the gate, right? The experience of being invaded, and again, the Mongol experience, deep in the collective psyche of Russians, that we must repel the invader and nothing else matters. But Russia hasn't been invaded here, and I just don't see the populace rallying. I think I think they have already scraped the bottom of the barrel in terms of who they can put into the battle lines, and they don't have forces even sufficiently trained, I think, to carry out the not always hugely sophisticated sorts of tactics that they used in World War II. Right. But again, Ukraine, I think it's a matter of whether they are properly supplied. But my feeling is that the Russian army is close to breaking.
Well, a question I have is, and I wrote about this just briefly in my editor's column in SITREP, which is not, I don't think is yet out on the web. And that is, as Ukraine's military continues to be successful and they roll further and further towards towards Crimea. As you know, Crimea has been occupied by Russia since 2014. And in Sevastopol, it is the home of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Is that going to be a red line for Putin in terms of, if it looks as if there's a potential for a conventional defeat, in Ukraine, that in Crimea, and Ukraine could retake it. Do you think this is something he's going to accept, or is that going to be the point at which he decides to utilize a nuclear weapon?
It's hard to know what Putin's mental state is at this point. I mean, we spent decades working on escalation dominance and ladders and things like that, trying to figure out, well, if he does this and we do that, at what point do intermediate or even intercontinental missiles start flying? But all of that, of course, did rely upon a certain kind of rationality, including that the classic, the value of the rational value of appearing to be slightly irrational. If Putin can convince people that he would do that, even if it would be insane, then they might say, well, let's not take Crimea. But I could also imagine people in Russia, high up in political, even military circles, saying to the West, basically at this point, look, if Ukraine agrees not to retake Crimea, we'll shoot Putin and make peace. And I would think the Ukrainians might be tempted by that because, their historical claim to Crimea is not as strong as their claim even to some of the areas where, of course, the Russians deliberately moved in Russians, but that you could argue were historically Ukrainian. But this was always early on in the war. A lot of people who seem to me to know less about military things even than I do by a wide margin were saying, oh, well, we should just impose a no-fly zone over Ukraine. And I was saying, but what you're talking about is NATO jets destroying the Russian Air Force. And if you think Putin wouldn't regard that as grounds for firing on NATO air bases, possibly with tactical nuclear weapons, I think you shouldn't be trusted with military decisions. But this one, because who are you going to nuke? You're going to hit Russians.
Right.
So it's if Putin were rational, and maybe once I've said those words, I should stop. But if Putin were rational, I don't think he would do this. It's very hard to see how Russia retains any pretense of being in the civilized community of nations if it uses nuclear weapons, especially if, including where fallout comes onto Crimean territory.
Right.
But again, the other question is, so if he did do this, presumably attacking Ukrainian forces in Ukraine, what's the American response? Do they target Russian forces in Ukraine? And I don't think they fire into Russia. Here, I'm always reminded of that scene from the Maltese Falcon where Gutman is threatening to torture Sam Spade, and Spade points out that it's no good threatening to torture someone unless you can credibly threaten to kill them. And Gutman says that in such situations, men are liable to forget where their best interests lie. And of course, that's a tactic by the torturer. They have to seem like they're going to lose it in order to make an otherwise irrational threat credible.
Right.
But I don't really see how Putin can believe that a use of even of tactical first use even of tactical nuclear weapons will not create a situation in the long run that is disastrous for Russia in every respect, including the absolute determination of the West that he will not be allowed to keep Crimea once he's done a thing of this sort. And who knows, maybe that's the signal for the United States to take out the Black Sea Fleet. Maybe that would be this, or conventional weapons aimed at Russian military assets in Russia in response to a tactical nuke, but on a fairly serious level, daring him to fire at American forces. I think it's, but again, if I were in Putin's inner circle, such as it is, I would be thinking that it really was time he retired out a fourth-story window, that he has got them to a situation that is already disastrous and could easily get a whole lot worse. But, it's surprising how many tyrants die in their beds, even if Stalin may, I think, have gotten a little help at the end.
Yeah, falling out of windows seems to be a rather typical sort of end for a lot of people.
Well, it's his turn, right?
Yeah, it's his turn. Another question, again, from Harrison, which is somewhat related to what we just spoke about, is sort of the mood of Russian people. I think we saw in the last even 24 hours that Putin had set up what was ultimately referred to as a stage meeting with Russian mothers. I think, and these were mothers who actually had not been complaining about the fact that their sons or husbands or whoever were actually quote unquote recruited and sent into the Russian military. And this was something I think that happened as well in the Afghanistan conflict, which was apparently one of the things that started to really turn the entire Russian population around in terms of not supporting what Russia was doing in Afghanistan, the Russian mothers who had lost sons and husbands and uncles and so on. Do you have any sense of where you think the Russian population is at this point in time? And do you think that even if large-scale resistance were to emerge, that this would make any difference to Putin's calculations at this point in time?
Well, going by the historical record, the Russian populace does not have a much of a record of pushing back against government policy. A certain degree of anarchy may erupt in some situations, but they don't have even like what's happening in China, right? And you look back to things like the Boxer Rebellion, that under some circumstances you can get these mass movements in China, although again, the general rule there is the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. But I would think, again, I mean, it's like if you asked Russians during the Afghan war for their honest opinion of Afghanistan, it would be, the polite version would be, if it was a fish, I would throw it back. And so the idea that they were going and being killed by these people for that country, I don't think Russians felt that they really had a civilizing mission with regard to Afghanistan. And I don't think they thought the Afghanistans would want to be civilized. They probably had privately very negative views of them. Right. They probably have more positive views of Ukrainians, but at the same time, again, I think that if Ukraine had invaded Russia, again, I think you might have got a response like you saw in the Great Patriotic War, this astonishing, we're going to hang on to the death. I remember it was a story of Kenneth Edelman during the arms control negotiations. He met with a senior Russian officer who'd been involved in the defense of Leningrad during the war, who told him that he hadn't been inside a building for 18 months. They said, guard the road, and we guarded the road. But are Russians really willing to see their sons and husbands killed in order to make Ukraine appreciate the virtues of Putin's rule? They probably have sort of typical sort of, like people used to make jokes about Newfoundlanders, and I can't probably say the word anymore. I imagine that there's a certain kind of level of genial ethnic hatred even for the Ukrainians, and bewilderment that they don't want any part of Russia. But I wouldn't have thought that the Russian people were really keen to sacrifice for a war that doesn't seem to have much point to them. So I suspect the populace is not enthusiastic. But again, I think the Russian populace has not been enthusiastic about a lot of things going back to the Mongols, and there just wasn't anything you could do about it. And the idea is hunker down, this too will pass. So I don't think Putin's in danger from a popular uprising. I think he's in much more danger of being assassinated by somebody who thinks you're going to get us all killed and ruin the fun we're having here. Although, again, they must also have some feeling that if Putin goes, what possible pretext do we have for holding together the system of plutocracy? If it's not even plutocracy, really, because you get very, very rich, but money doesn't protect you. 1 minute you're rich, and the next minute you're flying out a window. But whatever it is that's going on, how do you maintain it? If you get rid of Putin, what do you put in his place, and what's your excuse? What's your new ideology? Because people do need them. And I remember there's just a classic story from the 1905 uprising where crowds were gathering and were told to shout Constantini Constitutia, Constantine and Constitution, but a lot of them thought that Constitutia must be his wife. So it wasn't a high information revolt. Russians today, of course, are rather better informed, but there isn't a tradition of civic society in Russia. So I don't think they're very happy. But again, I don't think that's keeping Putin up nights. Whatever is worrying him, I doubt it's that.
A couple of months back, I guess going back as far as April now, we had an online conference, and one of our participants was Dr. Benita Renz, who has written extensively on the Russian military. And one of the things that she was sort of surprised at, but not surprised at, was the idea that one of the main driving factors in the poor performance of the Russian military was the high degree of corruption. And that a lot of what was being told to Putin in terms of what his military expenditures were and the degree of readiness, et cetera, was really just hiding the fact that there was a huge element of corruption within the Russian military sphere. Would you concur with that? Do you think that's a possible explanation as to why the Russian military has not performed to the level we might have anticipated in the West?
I think that is unquestionably a significant factor. And I think back to one of Tom Clancy's perhaps less appreciated but really brilliant novels, Red Storm Rising, in which the Soviets engineer a conventional war in Western Europe. And one of the things that happens in the run-up to the war is that they execute a couple of colonels for faking readiness reports. And this causes a lot of consternation because everybody knows that everybody fakes readiness reports. And so it seems like tough luck for these two. But the funny thing is that Putin probably was not aware of it, because Putin has this notion of Russia as a shining moral beacon, and shining moral beacons are characterized by honesty. And so, again, tyrants shut themselves off even from basic information about the degree of ethnic cohesion, perhaps in the units, but also, the materials being diverted to build people's dachas. I assume that's still going on. I remember when I was in grad school, there was a guy who'd been in the Soviet Union, and he'd been in university there, and he was the leader of one of the obligatory political discussion groups. And he said it was quite a comfortable arrangement because nobody wanted to go to the meetings, so he never held any. And in return for not making them go, they all rated him a great discussion leader. So a lot of Russians, I think, have a very strong sense of what's going on. And for some of them, it's the cynicism just gets into their soul, and others long for a world in which things were not done that way. But again, it is amazing the degree to which people at the top can insulate themselves from this kind of thing. As the story, Gromyko, late in his time as Soviet foreign minister, was said that he hadn't set foot in the streets of Moscow in 40 years, and he probably hadn't. And so the extent to which he didn't know how ordinary Russians lived, that he had really no idea of how they thought or what the material level of their existence was. But I do remember, because Khrushchev is an interesting character, because he did come to, he rose up during the Stalinist period. There's a very ugly side to Khrushchev, but there's also a very human side. And when he visited the United States and he saw all the food in the supermarkets, he knew that this wasn't the way it was in Russia. And he knew that it was important that this isn't how it was. But again, if Putin travels abroad, all he sees, I think, is the decadence and the depravity. He doesn't see any of the strengths. It's like this Islamist who studied in the United States, and he was, I think, in Indianapolis in the 40s and found it to be a hotbed of depravity and flesh pots. And I thought, my goodness, Indianapolis in the 40s. I don't think that. I mean, of course, a famous longstanding problem in the Soviet army is the non-professional, non-commissioned officers. No. This has been a crippling weakness for ages. But is it the sort of thing that the leadership knew about, but said we have to continue to do it this way because the danger of a professional military with a sense of its own identity, it could be a threat to our power? Or was it something that they just didn't want to hear about and didn't hear about? Now, I've just been reading the memoirs of a former Canadian pilot who talked about certain really galling aspects of careerism, but also of delusion within the Air Force. There were officers who he called the true believers, who really thought there were capabilities that didn't exist. And if it can happen in the Canadian military, and I think it can, then it could certainly happen in the Russian military.
Oh boy. I am so tempted to go down another path, but I don't think we really have enough time to do that. We'll have you back at another time, and we'll take this in a different tack. So I don't see any other questions. I have a few others, but I think to respect your time, John, and the folks online, I won't ask them.
There's by the way, Calvin Coolidge, when he announced that he wasn't running for president again in 1928, someone asked him why, and he said, "In my experience, it's best to leave while they still want you."
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'm sure that's the case tonight, because that's exactly what I was going to say. You told us a lot about things that you were surprised at and things you were not surprised at, and I can tell you that I was not surprised at the insightfulness of your observations and comments. I have not been surprised by that. So this is a good thing for me.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and if anybody else wants to send me an email on anything about John's performance tonight, it was masterful. It was absolutely masterful. Yeah, so I'm thinking about things like, wow, a bunch of random thoughts. So we talk about in this particular course, I'm trying to revitalize, what is the future operational environment? Well, wait a minute. What about the current operational environment? And you mentioned artillery. My brother-in-law, who's an artillery officer, will be, I guess, both shocked and surprised, but also delighted by the fact that it's clear that artillery is still continuing to play an incredibly major role in here we are. I mean, nobody would have expected this in the 21st century in the middle of Europe, that we would be having trenches and artillery battles and so on. It's unbelievable. And yet this is the way. So as we're sitting around in our little seminar groups at the Canadian Forces College talking about what does the future operational environment look like? Well, I don't know. I think it looks like what it looks like right now. And what does that mean? Should we be talking to full colonels and brigadier generals about design thinking, reflective thinking? Or should we be talking about how we employ, artillery regiments? Not that we have any, but
yeah, but if we did.
But if we, you know what I'm saying? I mean, okay, so we could go down that road. Gromke versus Justin Trudeau, that was something that came to my mind. Delusions, we could go down that. Capabilities that do not exist, we could go down that road. We won't for tonight, but we will come back at some point in time. Because as you said, I think the real surprise for you is what you ended up talking about tonight, as opposed to what you thought you might have been talking about, say, 4, 5, 6 months ago. And I have no doubt that 4 to 5, 6 months from now, we're going to have a different perspective on where we are at. We don't know what that's going to look like, but it's going to be very interesting. So I hope that you might be open to come back and talking to us again in a few months' time and offer your insights and expertise and always wonderful sense of humor and irony too, because that's what makes all of this good stuff interesting.
Where to find me?
I do indeed, and I hope that we'll be able to have you in person,
yes,
as we originally planned, once things get sorted out on the COVID-19 front in the next few months. So, on behalf of the Royal Canadian Military Institute, I want to thank you. I need to thank the Nuja from our office, who's one of the folks behind the scenes that makes this work. Sylvia Lau, Eric Morse. And if the new president is online, I need to thank him as well, Mike Clary, in case I get fired. But on top of all of that, all of the members who have seen you here tonight, appreciate it. And also the many, many more who will see you online, I'm sure are going to appreciate it as well. So John, thanks for your time and your expertise. And we look forward to seeing you again in person and online in the next little while. So take care of yourself. Thank you very much.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.